There is a drawer in the back bedroom of the Sloan Ranch house that nobody opens anymore except me. It is a small drawer, sticks a little in the summer when the wood swells from the heat. You have to know just where to press right corner firm, but not hard, or it will fight you. I have opened that drawer 10,000 times in 20 years, and my hand still knows the exact pressure without thinking about it. Inside there is not much. A folded letter, a small tin button that belonged to my father, and a ring. The ring is made of oak, cut from a branch that fell during the winter storms of 1886 when the wind came down from the north and took half the old tree by the creek. I found the branch in the snow the next morning, picked it up without knowing why, carried it back to the barn, and set it on the workbench where it sat for 3 weeks before I understood what I was going to do with it. I spent 3 months making that ring. 3 months of evenings by the lamp carving and sanding and starting over. My father's old chisels, a piece of sandpaper worn so thin I had to fold it twice to get any use from it. My hands are not big hands, never were, but they are patient hands. My father taught me that not with words, but by letting me watch him work. You do not need to be strong, he used to say, if you are willing to be slow. The ring is small, too small as it turned out. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is what happens when you are past 50 and trying to tell a story. You keep reaching for the end before you have laid the ground. Let me start where it started. Not with the ring, and not with the day she stepped off Fletcher Knox's wagon. Let me start with the night I sat down at my kitchen table with a blank piece of paper and a pen that kept running dry and tried to write down who I was in a way that might make someone want to know me. The winter of 1886 going into 1887 was a hard one across the territory. Not just the cold, though. The cold was something that year, the kind that gets into the walls of a cabin, no matter how well you have chinked them, the kind that makes the horses stand with their backs to the wind and their heads low for days at a time. It was hard in the way that isolation gets hard, slow and quiet and pressing like water finding its way under a door. I had been on the Sloan Ranch for 6 years by then. Came out with my father when I was 22, the two of us hauling everything we owned in a wagon that groaned on every rut. My mother had been gone 3 years by that point. Fever took her in the spring of 1880 fast and without warning the way fever does. My father did not talk about it. He just started making plans to go west, and I understood that the plans were his way of surviving. We built the cabin ourselves that first summer. Took longer than we expected. My father was not a tall man either. The Sloan men ran to the smaller side, which was something the territory reminded us of regularly, but he knew how to work. How to think a problem through before picking up a tool. How to stop when he was tired instead of pushing through and making mistakes he would have to undo. I watched him the way young men watch their fathers when they are still young enough to admit they are watching. We put in the first fence that fall. Bought 3 head of cattle from a man named Purvis, who was heading back east with his tail between his legs and his ambitions considerably reduced. Started small. Stayed patient. For 4 years the two of us worked the land together. It was not an easy life, but it was a good one. And I did not understand how much of its goodness came from having another person in the cabin until my father got sick in the autumn of 1884. It was his lungs. Started as a cough in September, the kind a man ignores because there is too much to do before winter. By November he could not get through a morning's work without stopping to rest. By January he was spending most of the day in bed, and by February I knew. I sat with him most nights that last month. The cabin was small, 1 main room, 2 sleeping alcoves divided by a curtain my mother had sewn before she died. I would pull my chair close to his cot and we would talk or sit in silence, or sometimes I would read to him from the one book we had, a collection of poems that had belonged to my mother. He never much cared for poetry, but he liked the sound of words in the dark. One night near the end he reached out and put his hand on my arm. His grip was still strong. He was that kind of man, strong right to the last. "Keep this land," he said. "Don't let it end quiet." I told him I would. He died in March of 1885. I buried him under the old oak tree by the creek because that was where he liked to sit on the rare evenings when the work was done and there was still light left. I carved his name into the bark. Thomas Sloan. The bark has grown around the letters now, and the name sits deeper in the wood every year, and I find that fitting. After that, I was alone on the land. 2 years of it by the winter of 1887. 2 years of cooking for one and working for one, and lying awake listening to the wind against walls that my father's hands had helped build. I was not unhappy exactly. I had work, and work has its own comfort. But there is a weight that comes with solitude, not the weight of sadness, but the weight of silence. And I had begun to feel it in a way I could not sleep off or work through. It presses down that kind of silence, not all at once, gradually like snow accumulating on a roof. You do not notice it until one evening you sit down at the kitchen table after supper and realize that you have not spoken a word to another human being in 9 days. That was the evening I got out the paper. I wrote 9 drafts before I wrote the one I sent. I know it was 9 because I counted the torn sheets afterward, smoothing each one out on the table to look at what I had tried to say and failed. They were all wrong in different ways. The first was too eager reading it back. I sounded like a man who had been alone so long he had forgotten how to be casual about it. The second was too stiff, like a legal document. The third tried to be funny and was not. The fourth was honest in ways I immediately regretted. I sat at that table for most of the night. The lamp burned low, and I trimmed the wick and kept going. Outside, the wind moved through the grass the way it does in this country, not the angry howl of a storm, but that long, steady, lonely sound that is just the land breathing. What I wanted to say was this: I am a small man in a country that does not have much patience for small men, and I have a ranch that I built with my father's hands and my own, and I have kept a promise I made to a dying man, and I am 33 years old, and I would like very much to have someone to talk to in the evenings. What I finally wrote was something tidier than that. But those were the words underneath. Honest rancher seeks gentle companion for frontier life. Must appreciate simple pleasures and quiet evenings. I am not a wealthy man, but I am a steady one. I believe real partnership means 2 people making each other stronger, not one person making the other feel smaller. If that sounds like something you are looking for, I would be glad to hear from you. I folded it before I could read it again, put on my coat and boots and walked out into the cold night and put it in the box at the end of the drive where Knox sometimes stopped on his rounds. The stars were out clear and bright the way they get in winter out here, so many of them it hardly seems real. I stood there for a moment looking up at them. Then I went back inside and went to bed. The town of Harlan's Creek sat 4 miles from my eastern fence line, close enough to reach in under an hour on horseback, far enough to feel separate from. It was not a large town. A main street of maybe 12 buildings, a church at one end and a livery at the other, with the general store, the feed merchant, 2 saloons, a barber, and a scattering of homes filling in between. The population ran to about 200 when you counted the outlying ranches, which people usually did because it made the number more respectable. It was the kind of town that knew its own business and everyone else's. News traveled the way it always travels in small places, not through any organized system, but through a web of small observations and sidewalk conversations, and the particular attention that people pay when they have known each other long enough to notice changes. I had lived within 4 miles of Harlan's Creek for 6 years, and I was known there in the way that quiet people are known, recognized, nodded to, thought of as reliable and not particularly interesting. I bought my supplies from Henderson's general store, traded at the feed merchants, had my horses shot at the livery. I went to church most Sundays because my father had gone to church most Sundays, and some habits carry forward without examination. I had a beer occasionally at the quieter of the 2 saloons, always at the end of the bar, always the one beer. I was not disliked. I was simply not noticed in the way that a man like Samuel Morrison was noticed. Morrison had the largest ranch in the valley, 3 times the size of mine, running several hundred head of cattle, employing 4 permanent hands and more during roundup season. He was a big man, Morrison, wide through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had been made for gripping things, and a voice that carried across a room without effort. He had come to the territory 8 years before I had, which gave him a seniority that he wore without being obvious about it, but wore nonetheless. My father and Morrison had known each other. Had started in the territory at roughly the same time, in fact, and there had been a friendship there in the early years or something close to it. I did not know exactly when it had cooled or why. My father did not speak of it, and I had learned that the things my father did not speak of were usually things that had cost him something. What I knew was this: when my father died, and I was left alone on the Sloan land, Morrison had come to see me within a week, had sat in my kitchen with his hat in his hands and said he was sorry for my loss, and then before he left had asked me carefully, politely, whether I had considered what I would do with the property. I told him I would keep it. He nodded, said that was fine, said the offer stood if I ever changed my mind. He had asked twice more in the 2 years since, always politely, always the same answer from me. There was nothing hostile about it on the surface, but underneath the politeness was something else, a patience that was not quite patience, more like a man watching a situation he believed would eventually resolve itself in his favor. I did not like it, but I did not know what to do about it, and so I did what I did with most things I could not change. I worked my land and kept my fence repaired and tried not to think about it. I received one response to my advertisement. 1. I had prepared myself for none, so one felt like something close to abundance. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in February, tucked between a seed catalog and a notice from the county assessor's office. I almost missed it. The envelope was plain, no return address, the handwriting on the front careful and deliberate in a way that suggested the writer had thought about each letter before committing it to paper. I sat down at the kitchen table before I opened it. Inside were 4 pages covered on both sides in that same careful script. I read it twice through before I moved. Her name was Willa Blaine. She was 31 years old, from the Montana Territory, raised on a cattle ranch that her father and 2 brothers still operated. She had come across my advertisement in a territorial paper that had passed through several hands before reaching her, which she mentioned with a directness I found immediately appealing. She did not pretend the circumstances were more romantic than they were. She was looking, she wrote, for a life that was quieter than the one she had, and for a person who understood what she meant by quiet, not the absence of work, but the absence of noise that came from people who could not leave well enough alone. She wrote about loneliness in a way I recognized, not dramatized, not asking for sympathy, just described plainly the way you describe weather or terrain. There is a particular weight that comes from being always around people and never quite with them. She had written that, and I had read it standing at the kitchen window with the winter fields outside, and the words had felt so accurate that I had to put the letter down for a moment. She asked good questions. What kind of cattle did I run? What was the land like in spring? Did I have neighbors close or far, and what were they? Had I always intended to stay in this place, or had I come to it sideways the way many people came to frontier life through loss or failure, or simply the running out of other options? She did not mention her appearance, not once. I wrote back the same evening, then again 2 weeks later when her reply came, then again and again through the late winter and into the early spring, until we had exchanged enough letters that I felt I knew the shape of her, thinking the particular way her mind moved around a question, the things she said plainly, and the things she approached from the side. I started the ring in March, the day after her first letter arrived. It seemed at the time like the right thing to do with the evenings. She wrote in her last letter that she was ready to make the journey if I was ready to receive her. I wrote back that I was. Fletcher Knox, who drove a circuit between the outlying settlements carrying goods and mail, and occasionally people agreed to bring her down from where the main stage left her, a town 3 days' ride north. I did not sleep well the week before she arrived. The morning of her arrival was a Friday in late April. I woke before dawn and did the feeding in the dark, and then went back inside and made coffee and sat with it at the kitchen table. The ring was in my vest pocket. I had put it there the night before and checked for it 3 times since waking. The neighbors knew she was coming. That was the thing about Harlan's Creek. You could not keep the arrival of a mail-order bride quiet in a town that size, and I had not tried. Knox had mentioned it to someone, and from there it had moved through the town with the speed and enthusiasm that news of unusual things always moves in small places. By mid-morning there were people finding reasons to be near my drive. Ba Henderson had come out on the pretext of returning a bucket she claimed my father had lent her some years back, a pretext so thin it was nearly transparent since my father had been dead 2 years, and she had not mentioned this bucket in all that time. She stood near the fence with the bucket in her hands and her husband beside her, both of them looking down the road toward town. Young Tommy Morrison, Samuel Morrison's youngest, 10 years old, and not yet old enough to understand that staring was something you were supposed to pretend not to do, had simply sat himself down on the top rail of my fence, without invitation, and was watching the road with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a boy at a fair. A few others had gathered at a respectful distance that was not very respectful. I stood in the yard. The ring was in my vest pocket. I had imagined this moment many times over the past months, the wagon coming down the road, the dust, the slowing of wheels. I had imagined a woman stepping down who matched the writing of those letters, careful, direct, thoughtful. I had given her a face in my imagination that was gentle, and hands that were small, and a manner that was quiet, in the particular way she had described wanting her life to be. I had not thought carefully about any other possibilities. The wagon came into sight around the bend in the road at 10:30 in the morning, Fletcher Knox on the box with his hat pulled low against the spring sun. I heard it before I saw it, the particular sound of that Rig Knox's 2 bay horses, the creak of the wheels on the dry road. I straightened up, put my hand against my vest pocket for a moment. The wagon slowed and turned in at my gate. Knox pulled the horses up in the yard and set the brake, and for a moment there was just the sound of the horses blowing and the creak of the wood settling and the very particular quality of silence that falls over a crowd of people who are all trying not to appear to be watching. The wagon door opened. She stepped down. I have told this story before in the years since. I have told it at the supper table and on the porch in the evenings, and once to a young man who was about to give up on something important and needed to hear it. Each time I tell it, I try to find the right words for that moment. I have not found them yet. She was tall. That was the first thing, not because it was the most important thing, but because it was the thing that arrived first before thought or consideration or any of the more complicated things that came after. She was tall in the way that certain trees are tall, the ones that grew up with enough water and light and space, the ones that did not have to compete or compensate. 6 feet in her worn boots, maybe a touch more, shoulders that were broad and straight. Hands, I noticed her hands that were the hands of someone who had worked hard and long with them and did not apologize for it. She stepped down from the wagon and stood in my yard and looked at me, and I looked at her. The ring in my vest pocket suddenly felt like evidence of a misunderstanding so complete and so public that I wanted very briefly to walk into the barn and close the door behind me and not come out until everyone had gone home. Behind me, I heard Mrs. Henderson say something low to her husband. I did not catch the words, but I did not need to. Tommy Morrison, up on the fence rail, said something out loud that his mother, arriving just then from down the road, cut off sharply by pulling him down by the arm. Fletcher Knox on the wagon box cleared his throat and busied himself with the reins in a way that suggested he had been waiting for this moment with some anxiety and was now deeply committed to not being part of it. The 3 of us, Willa Blaine and me and Knox, up on the wagon, stood in the configuration of people who have arrived at a moment that none of them fully prepared for. She was the first to move. She looked at me with an expression that I could not immediately read, not quite what I had feared, not the open disappointment of someone who has arrived to find a poor bargain, but something more careful than that. Something that suggested she was doing the same arithmetic I was doing and finding it similarly unexpected. Then she walked toward me. Each step deliberate and unhurried, the way she would later walk toward a 1,800-pound bull that had already sent 2 grown men running, though I did not know that yet. She stopped 2 feet in front of me, close enough that I had to look up to meet her eyes, which were gray and clear and considerably steadier than mine. She put out her hand. "You must be Emmett," she said. Her voice was lower than I had imagined it, not in an unkind way, just lower the way a river is lower than a stream with more in it. There was no mockery in her face and no pity, just a directness that I recognized from her letters and found despite everything steadying. I took her hand. Her grip was firm and careful, at the same time the grip of someone who knew exactly how strong they were and thought about it. "I suppose we should talk," she said. The way she said it was not unkind, but it was honest. And honest at that moment in that yard with half of Harlan's Creek watching from a distance that they were pretending was accidental was about the best I could have hoped for. I nodded. Fletcher Knox climbed down from the wagon and began unloading her trunk. It was large, larger than the room I had prepared for it, though I did not know that yet, either with the particular efficiency of a man who wants to look busy. The crowd at my fence line had gone quiet, and somewhere in the back of my mind, underneath the embarrassment and the surprise and the complicated weight of a moment that was nothing like I had imagined, something small and unexpected, was beginning something I would not have a name for until much later looking back. But that is how it is with the things that matter. They do not announce themselves. They begin quietly in the middle of something else while you are busy being surprised by the wrong things. We did not talk right away. That is the thing nobody tells you about moments that are supposed to be significant. They do not pause and wait for you to be ready for them. Life keeps moving. The horses need water. The trunk needs carrying the crowd. At the fence line needs something to look at besides two people standing in a yard not knowing what to say to each other. Knox handled the horses. I handled the trunk. Or I tried to. Willa Blaine's trunk was made of dark wood banded with iron, and it was the largest piece of personal luggage I had ever seen outside of a hotel lobby. I got my hands under one end and lifted, and the trunk communicated to me immediately, and without ambiguity, that it had not been built for one man of my particular dimensions to move unassisted. I did not ask for help. That was the thing. I stood there with my end of the trunk lifted maybe 4 inches off the wagon bed, my face doing things I was grateful nobody was directly watching, and I considered my options. Willa came around the side of the wagon. She did not make a production of it, did not sigh or shake her head or offer any commentary. She simply picked up the other end of the trunk as though it weighed considerably less than it did, and we carried it between us through the cabin door, though we had to angle it sideways to fit the trunk, being wider than the frame had anticipated. And there was a moment in the doorway where we were both stopped and close together, and I could smell the road dust on her coat and the faint, clean scent underneath it. "Left or right?" she asked, meaning the sleeping alcoves. "Right," I said. We set it down. The floor registered the weight. "Thank you," I said. She looked at the room. It was small. I had cleaned it the day before, swept the floor, put clean bedding on the cot, set a tin cup of early wildflowers on the windowsill because it had seemed like the right thing to do at the time, and now seemed possibly like too much. She looked at the flowers for a moment. "That was thoughtful," she said. Her voice was neutral in a way that could have meant anything. Then she went back outside to see about her other bags, and I stood in the small room and breathed for the first time in several minutes. The afternoon moved the way difficult afternoons move slowly and with too much in it. Knox stayed for a cup of coffee, which I was grateful for because it meant there was a third person present, and conversation could be general rather than specific. He told us about the road conditions coming south, about a bridge that was soft on the west side after the spring thaw, about a family he had passed who were heading further west with everything they owned, piled in a wagon that looked unlikely to make it another 50 miles. Willa listened, asked a question or two about the road. She had, I noticed, a particular way of listening, not the polite waiting for her turn kind, but the actual kind where you could see that she was taking in what was said and turning it over. Knox left mid-afternoon, climbed onto his wagon with the relieved expression of a man who has successfully navigated a social situation he had been dreading and is now free to go. He tipped his hat to Willa, nodded to me, clicked to his horses. The dust settled. We were alone. I made supper. Salt pork and beans and cornbread, not elegant but solid, and I was a better cook than the food suggested, which is to say I was a competent cook of simple things. I had been feeding myself for 2 years, and I had not yet poisoned myself, which I considered the relevant benchmark. Willa sat at the table and did not offer to help, which I had already noticed she did in the way that a person does who has thought about it and made a decision. Not rudeness, something else. as though she understood that the kitchen was mine and did not want to take it from me. We ate. The beans were good. The cornbread was better. "You grind your own meal," she said. Not a question. She had seen the stone mill on the shelf. "My father's," I said. "He brought it from Missouri." She nodded, ate, looked around the cabin with the careful attention of someone taking inventory, not critical, just thorough, the way a person looks at a place they are trying to understand. "The garden is well kept," she said. "I put it in 3 years ago. Took the first year to get the soil right. What did you amend it with?" And just like that, we were talking about soil composition and what grows well at this elevation, and the particular difficulty of getting carrots to come in straight when the ground is rocky, and the conversation was easier than I had expected because it was about something real and external that neither of us had to be careful about. Later, after the dishes were done, she washed, I dried, which happened without discussion. Both of us simply moving into the positions that made sense. We sat on opposite ends of the small porch and watched the evening come down over the valley. The light at that hour is something in this country. The sun drops behind the western ridge, and for 20 minutes the whole valley goes gold and then pink, and then a deep, quiet blue that is unlike any other blue I have seen. My father used to say it was the land's way of apologizing for everything it put you through during the day. Willa sat with her hands in her lap and looked at it. I tried to think of something to say and found nothing that seemed adequate. After a while she said quietly and without looking at me, "It's beautiful here." "Yes," I said. That was all for a time. But it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have each decided separately to give the other a little room. I thought about her letters, about the careful handwriting and the honest sentences, and the particular way she had described loneliness, like weather, like terrain, something you navigate rather than something that defeats you. I had read those letters so many times that winter that I could have recited passages from them, and sitting beside this woman who was so much larger and quieter and more real than anything I had imagined, I found myself searching for the connection between the words I had memorized and the person now sitting 4 feet away from me on my porch. It was there. That was what surprised me. Under the shock of the afternoon, under the embarrassment and the adjustment, and the very complicated feeling of having your expectations turned entirely around, it was there. The same mind that had written those sentences was sitting on my porch. I could hear it in the way she talked about the garden, in the way she had looked at the valley light and called it beautiful without feeling the need to say more than that. I reached into my vest pocket and touched the ring. Then I took my hand away. Not yet. It was not yet. She had come from the Montana Territory, she had said in her letters, raised on a cattle ranch that her family had worked for 20 years. 3 brothers of fatherland that went on longer than you could see on a clear day. What she had not said, not in any of the letters, was why she had left it. There are things people do not write in letters. Things that live in the space between sentences and the questions that are not asked, because asking them would require answering them in return. I had my own such things, the particular weight of 2 years alone on land, that my father's hands had shaped the way silence can become a presence in itself after long enough, and I had not written those directly either. Had written around them, at them, close to them, but not directly at them. I thought about that sitting on the porch in the fading light. I thought about my father. Thomas Sloan had been by any conventional measure a small man, 5 feet 6 inches in his boots, which were not boots with any significant heel to speak of, narrow through the shoulders, hands that were fine-boned, more suited to the woodworking he loved than to the cattle work that the land required. The territory had not been particularly kind to him on account of his size, not cruel, not openly, not in ways that could be pointed to and named. Just the particular unkindness of a place and time that had a clear idea of what a man was supposed to look like, and was not shy about communicating when a man did not match that idea. I had watched it my whole childhood, the slight pause before people took him seriously. The way certain men like Morrison Large and certain of themselves, had a way of speaking to my father that was technically respectful and actually not. The way my father had absorbed all of it without apparent damage, or at least without visible damage, and had simply continued doing the work he was doing. He never talked about it directly. But one evening when I was maybe 16 years old and had come home from town with the particular expression of a boy who has been reminded of his smallness in front of other people, he had sat down across from me at the table and said this: "A man's worth is in what he builds and what he keeps, not in how much space he takes up." Then he got up and went back to what he was doing. I had thought about those words many times in the years since. They had not always been enough. There were nights when they were not close to enough, but they were always there like the mill on the shelf, something he had left behind that still did its work. I wondered, sitting on the porch beside Willa Blaine on her first evening at the Sloan Ranch, what he would have made of her. I thought he would have liked her. I thought he would have seen something in her directness, that he recognized the quality of a person who has had to establish their own terms, because the world's terms did not fit them. I thought he would have been considerably less surprised than I was. In the morning everything changed. Not between us, that would take longer and harder things than a night's sleep. What changed was the morning itself arriving with a problem that had nothing to do with two people navigating the strange territory of being strangers who had agreed to consider marriage. I woke at first light as I always did, made the coffee, did the morning feeding, came back inside to find Willa already up, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around the tin cup I had left out for her, looking out the window at the early sky with an expression I could not read. We drank our coffee. I made eggs. She ate without ceremony. Then I went out to do the second check of the morning, the fence line walk I did every day before the work proper began, and found the north section of fence down. Not just leaning. Down. 3 posts pulled clean from the ground, the wire coiled back on itself, and the large, flat-footed prints of my prize bull Dakota pressed into the soft earth on the wrong side of the fence line, heading east, heading toward Henderson's property. I stood there for a moment with my coffee going cold in my hand, looking at those tracks, and felt something drop in my stomach. Dakota was not a bad bull. He was in fact an excellent bull by every measure that mattered, well-formed, healthy, had sired calves that were the best on the Sloan land. But he was not a cooperative bull. He had the temperament of a man who has decided that the rules of social engagement do not apply to him, and he had the physical means to enforce that position. He went close to 1,800 pounds. His horns curved wide and low. 2 of my neighbors had learned in separate incidents over the past year that approaching him from the front when he was in a mood was an experience that ended with them on the wrong side of a fence, sometimes airborne. Henderson's property was 3 parcels over. Henderson had a garden. I started walking. I heard it before I saw it. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried across the valley the way thunder carries, not the sharp crack of the close kind, but the rolling, sustained kind that comes from a long way off and keeps coming. By the time I reached the edge of her property, I could make out the words, and none of them were good. The garden had been her primary occupation and her primary pride. 3 years of work had gone into it. Roses along the south fence that she had brought as cuttings from her mother's place back east, wrapped in damp cloth for the entire journey. Arranged border stones. Beds that were the envy of the women in Harlan's Creek and the source of multiple ribbons at the county gathering. Dakota had found it to be an acceptable place to spend the night. He was standing in the middle of it when I came through the gate. His massive head lowered one front hoof, moving in a slow, meditative way over what had recently been a rose bed. Around him, 3 years of careful cultivation were variously trampled, scattered or pressed flat into the ground. The border stones were scattered like thrown dice. 2 men from the neighboring properties were standing at the fence line with ropes maintaining the specific distance of men who have already made one attempt and found the results instructive. One of them, Garfield, from the next place east, had a tear in his coat sleeve that had not been there before. Mrs. Henderson was on her front steps. She was a woman in her middle 50s, solid and capable, with a voice she knew how to use. She was using it. "That animal has destroyed everything," she said when she saw me coming. Her face was the color of brick. "Look at it, Emmett Sloan. Just look at it. 3 years. 3 years of work. You are going to pay for every plant, and if you cannot control your livestock, you have no business keeping them." I stood at the edge of the destruction and looked at Dakota, who looked back at me with the flat, unconcerned gaze of a creature who does not recognize the concept of consequences. I had no argument with Mrs. Henderson. She was entirely right. I also had no practical solution to offer because the practical solution, getting Dakota out of the garden and back to the Sloan land, was a problem that exceeded my physical capacity in ways that the current audience was going to observe at close range. Garfield caught my eye and shook his head slightly. He had tried. He was not going to try again. The other man, Briggs, from the south quarter, was already edging toward the fence with the expression of someone recalculating how important it was for him to be present. "I'll get him out," I said. I said it with more confidence than I had. Then from beside me came a voice. "How long has he been in here?" Willa was standing at my elbow. She had followed me from the ranch without my noticing, or I had been walking too fast and too worried to look back, which was more likely. She was looking at Dakota with an expression I had not yet learned to read, focused and still the way a person looks when they are calculating something. "Since sometime last night," I said. "The north fence was down when I went out this morning." She did not respond to that. She was watching the bull. His head had swung toward her when she spoke, a slow, heavy movement, and his nostrils were working. "Those men approached him from the front," she said. "Yes. He's not angry. He's unsettled. There's a difference." I looked at Dakota. He looked to me angry, but I was also aware that my experience reading the interior states of 1,800-pound animals was limited. "He'll charge again if they go at him straight," Willa said, "or if anyone rushes." Mrs. Henderson's commentary had not slowed. Behind us, I was aware of the gathering word traveled fast in Harlan's Creek when there was something to travel toward, and a bull in Henderson's garden qualified. I could hear more people arriving at the fence line, could feel without looking the quality of their attention. And then from the east road came the sound of horses, and I looked up to see Samuel Morrison riding in with two of his sons behind him. Of course. Morrison swung down from his horse and came through the gate with the ease of a man who was accustomed to arriving at situations and taking them over. He looked at the garden, looked at Dakota, looked at me with an expression that was carefully neutral in the particular way that made it worse than if it had been openly contemptuous. "Morning, Sloan," he said. "Quite a situation." "I'm handling it," I said. He looked at Garfield's torn coat sleeve, looked at Briggs, who had completed his journey to the fence and was now technically outside the enclosure, looked back at me. "Of course," he said. "His two sons. The eldest, James, was 19 and built like his father. All certainty and physical confidence arranged themselves behind Morrison in the way that young men arrange themselves behind a dominant figure, which is to say they stood slightly back and slightly to the side and let his presence do the work. Willa had not moved from her position at my elbow. She was still watching Dakota. Then she stepped forward, not toward Morrison, not toward the fence, toward the bull. "Willa," I said. She did not stop. "Willa." My voice came out louder than I intended. "He's dangerous when he's unsettled. You shouldn't—" But she was already moving across the ruined garden with long, deliberate strides, and something in the quality of her movement, that same quality I had noticed yesterday in the yard, the particular unhurriedness of it, made me stop speaking. I do not know why I stopped. I could say it was because I could see she knew what she was doing, but the truth is, I did not know that yet. The truth is, I stopped because something in the way she moved told me that stopping her would be the wrong thing, and I trusted that feeling before I could examine it. I have thought about that moment many times in the years since, that split second of decision. Every instinct I had said to call out to stop her, to take the situation in hand, in the way that the situation and the audience behind me seemed to be waiting for me to do, and something quieter than instinct said, "Let her. I let her." The garden went very still. Mrs. Henderson stopped mid-sentence. Morrison beside me now went quiet. His son James took a half-step forward and then stopped, uncertain for the first time since arriving. Willa walked toward the bull the way water moves down a slope, not hurrying, not hesitating, following the natural line of the thing. Dakota's head had come up. His eyes were showing white at the edges. His massive chest moved with each heavy breath. He was a large animal in a small space, and he had been in that space for several hours, and he was not at his best. Willa kept walking. She was talking to him. I could see her lips moving, and I caught fragments, not words exactly, or not words that I could make sense of, more like sound, made into language rhythmic and low the way water moves over stones. Not commanding, not sharp, just steady like something that has been going on for a long time and will keep going on. Dakota's ears moved, the slow twitching movement of an animal paying attention. His hoof stopped its pawing. Willa kept walking, 12 feet away now. 10. The crowd at the fence line had gone so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I was not looking at her. I was looking at Morrison. I do not know exactly when I shifted my attention from Willa to the man beside me, some point in the middle of it when I understood that she was going to be all right and that the more interesting thing was happening on Morrison's face. He was watching Willa the way a man watches something that does not fit into any category he has prepared for. The certainty was draining out of his expression the way color drains out of the sky after sunset, not all at once but steadily leaving something else behind that I had never seen there before. Confusion. Real confusion. The kind that is not comfortable for a man who is accustomed to being the one who understands things. I had spent years watching Morrison look at things and people and situations with the settled confidence of a man who had already categorized them. I had spent years being one of the things he had categorized. There was a particular quality to being on the receiving end of that confidence, a smallness it produced that had nothing to do with your actual dimensions. Standing there in Henderson's ruined garden watching Morrison watch Willa, I felt that smallness lift. Not vanish, it did not vanish, not that day, but lift the way morning lifts from a valley. Temporarily. Enough. 8 feet. 6. Willa stopped, extended one hand palm up toward the bull. "Easy there," she said, and her voice was clear enough now to carry. "You're not really angry, are you? Just confused and far from home." Dakota looked at her hand, looked at her face. His breathing was still heavy, but the aggression had gone out of the set of his head. That slight lowering, that pulling back of weight onto the haunches was gone. He was just an animal looking at a person now, which was a different thing entirely. She took the last 2 steps, put her hand on his neck just behind his left ear. The sound that came out of Dakota then was not a sound I had ever heard from him. A long, low exhalation, almost a sigh, the kind of sound that comes from something that has been holding tension and finally releases it. His head dropped. He leaned into her hand like a dog seeking attention from someone it trusts. Behind me, someone at the fence line made a sound. A small sound, not quite a word, more like the involuntary noise a person makes when they see something they cannot immediately account for. "Someone fetch a lead rope," Willa said. Her voice was entirely calm, as though she had not just walked up to an agitated bull and placed her hand on it. "From the Sloan barn, if someone wouldn't mind." Morrison's son James stood frozen. Garfield at the fence blinked. Knox, who had appeared at some point I had not noticed when turned and went for the barn at a near run. Willa kept her hand on Dakota's neck, moving her fingers in slow circles behind his ear, talking to him in that low, continuous way. The bull stood with his head down and his eyes half closed, approximately 1,800 pounds of animal that had been terrorizing the valley for the past several hours, behaving in this moment like an oversized lapdog. Knox came back with the rope, held it out at arm's length, not quite willing to step inside the range that the bull occupied. Willa took it without looking up, made a halter with movements that were too practiced and too smooth to be improvised. She had done this before many times, and her hands knew the configuration without consulting her eyes. Slipped it over Dakota's head. He accepted it. She led him out of what remained of Henderson's garden. He followed her as though they had an arrangement, his large hooves picking carefully over the scattered border stones, his head low and docile. The assembled neighbors parted before them like water. When she passed me, she glanced sideways. Not quite a smile, more the controlled expression of someone who has done a thing and would like to move past the doing of it. "That north fence post," she said without stopping. "We should fix it today." I turned and watched her walk across the field toward the Sloan land, my bull walking beside her, as though this was simply where he had always intended to go. Morrison was quiet beside me. I did not look at him. I looked at my hands for a moment, my small, patient hands, my father's hands, and then I looked at the woman walking across the field. And I thought about the man who had stood at a kitchen table at midnight and written 9 drafts of a letter, trying to describe himself accurately. I thought about how none of those drafts had anticipated this, how none of them could have. The crowd at the fence line began to break apart slowly in the way that crowds break apart when the thing they gathered for is over and the ordinary resumption of the day is beginning. Mrs. Henderson stood on her steps and looked at the devastation of her garden and did not say anything. The fury had gone out of her face, replaced by something more complicated. Morrison put his hat back on, said to no one in particular, "Well." Then he walked to his horse and gathered the reins and swung up into the saddle. His sons fell in behind him. Before he turned to ride out, he paused, looked at me, not the look I was accustomed to from him, not the calculating patience of it, something less settled. "Your father," he said, then stopped, seemed to reconsider. "Good fences make good neighbors, Sloan." He rode out. I stood in the ruin of Henderson's garden for a long moment after everyone had gone. Then I started back across the field toward my ranch, where a woman I had written 9 letters to was putting my bull away in his repaired pen and would shortly, I imagined, be waiting to have the conversation that we had not yet had. The ring was still in my vest pocket. The morning was not yet half over. We fixed the fence, or rather Willa fixed most of the fence while I handled the sections that required more precision than force, and we worked together in the first sustained quiet of her time on the ranch, the quiet of 2 people engaged in the same task, which is different from the quiet of 2 people not yet sure what to say to each other, and considerably easier. She worked efficiently, no wasted motion. She had a way with the post hole digger that suggested she had spent considerable time with one driving it into the hard ground, with the even considered rhythm of someone who knows that patience covers for a great deal of what force cannot accomplish. I noticed she had changed from her traveling clothes into something more practical. Work trousers worn and well fitted, a shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her forearms were tanned in the way that spoke of years of outdoor work. We had been at the fence for perhaps an hour when the sound of horses on the east road announced Morrison's return, this time with all 3 of his sons, and somewhat surprisingly with Samuel Morrison himself, carrying a length of new wire that he set down at the fence line without comment, as though he had simply been on his way somewhere and found himself here incidentally. James Morrison, the eldest, approached Willa while she was setting a post. He was a handsome young man with his father's build and his father's way of taking up space. "Maybe I could give you a hand with that," he said, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a 19-year-old who has not yet had that confidence redirected. "Looks like heavy work for—" He stopped himself. He had enough awareness for that at least. Willa looked up at him. Her expression was pleasant and completely closed. "I appreciate the thought," she said, "but I've got my rhythm now. Emmett could use a hand with the wire if you're willing." She said it without emphasis. No sharpness, no victory in it. Just the plain statement of what was needed and where. James Morrison stood for a moment without moving. His jaw tightened in the small, visible way of a young man at 19 who has not yet learned to absorb a quiet no. Then he turned and went to where I was working with the wire, and we stretched fence together in silence. Then he turned and went to where I was working with the wire, and we stretched fence together in silence, and I was careful not to look at his face. His father watched all of it. I could feel Morrison's attention the way you can feel weather before it arrives, a pressure of particular quality in the air. He was watching Willa work, and he was watching me, and he was working something out. I did not know exactly what he was working out, but I knew the shape of the calculation he was making because I had felt its results my whole life. He stayed until the fence was done. Before leaving, he walked the repaired line the way a man inspects work hands behind his back, eyes moving along the posts. He stopped at the section Willa had set and tested one of the posts with both hands, rocking it slightly. It did not move. He tested another. Same result. "Good work," he said. "To both of us, or to neither of us, or to the fence itself." Then he collected his sons and rode out for the second time that day. Willa watched him go. "Old friend of your father's," she said. Not quite a question. I looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "The way he looks at the land, like he's done the math on it before." I said nothing for a moment. Then, "They knew each other. Early days." She nodded, did not push further. But something in the brief exchange settled in me uneasily, the feeling that she had seen something clearly that I had been looking at sideways for 2 years. The afternoon was going toward evening. The valley was beginning to fill with the long light that preceded the gold hour. We gathered the tools and started back toward the cabin. At some point, walking, Willa said quietly, "This isn't what either of us expected, is it?" Not a question. "No," I said. We walked in silence for a few steps. "I should have been more specific," I said, though I was not sure what I would have specified. That I was shorter than average, that there were men in this town who measured everything by what they could lift, that I had placed that advertisement not out of confidence but out of the quiet desperation of a man who had made a promise to a dying father and was not entirely sure he could keep it alone. "About what?" she asked. She was looking at the middle distance at the valley going gold. I looked at my hands. "About feeling like I'm not enough. Not strong enough, not big enough, not—" I stopped. The words were more honest than I had intended exposed now in the evening air. Willa was quiet for long enough that I thought she might simply let the words stand there unanswered. Then she said, "You know what I saw this morning when I was walking toward that bull?" I shook my head. "I saw a man who cared more about whether I was safe than about what it looked like that he wasn't the one handling it." She paused. "Most men would have stopped me, would have insisted, even if they got hurt doing it." I thought about that, about the moment I had stopped myself from calling out, about how close I had come to doing exactly what she was describing. "I almost stopped you," I said honestly. "I know," she said, "but you didn't." We had reached the porch. The evening was settling over the valley and its colors, and somewhere down by the creek a bird was doing the business of the last light. She turned to face me. Her expression in the evening was different from her expression in the yard at noon, less closed or closed differently, the way a hand can be open and still careful about what it holds. "What I should have written," she said, "is that I'm tired of being looked at like I'm a problem to be solved or a test to be passed. I've spent my whole life having people decide what I am before I've finished saying hello." I understood that. I understood it more completely than she could have known. "So what do we do now?" I asked. She reached into the pocket of her work trousers and took out a folded piece of paper. I recognized it. The handwriting on the outside was mine. She unfolded it with the care of something that had been folded and unfolded many times. "Do you remember what you wrote in your third letter?" she asked. I did. I remembered the night I wrote it late, the lamp burning low, the words coming out more honestly than I had intended, and then deciding unusually to leave them. She did not read it out loud, just held it so that I could see the paragraph she meant, the one about partnership, about two people making each other stronger. "I kept all of them," she said. "Every letter you sent." She folded it again, put it back in her pocket. The evening held us both for a moment, the light and the bird by the creek, and the long grass moving in the small wind that came up at this hour. "I have to think," she said finally, "about all of it, and I expect you do too." She went inside. I sat down on the porch step and stayed there until the stars came out, which took a while and then stayed a while longer. The ring was in my vest pocket. The evening was cooling. Somewhere on the north pasture, Dakota was in his repaired pen, and the fence was solid, and the day had been nothing like anything I had prepared for. I thought about my father, about the oak tree by the creek with his name growing slowly deeper into the bark each year. A man's worth is in what he builds and what he keeps. I put my hand against my vest pocket. Not yet, I thought, but closer. 7 days. That is how long it took before I stopped listening for her footsteps and started simply hearing them. There is a difference. Listening for something means you are waiting for it to stop. You are holding the sound at a distance, examining it, reminding yourself that it is new and temporary and not yet yours to rely on. Simply hearing is what happens when a thing has become part of the ordinary texture of a place, when it belongs. I did not notice the change while it was happening. I noticed it on the morning of the 8th day when I woke before dawn and lay in the dark for a moment and heard her moving in the kitchen, the particular sound of her setting the coffee pot, the quiet scrape of the grate on the stove, and felt nothing but a simple, unexamined calm. Then I noticed the calm and understood what it meant and lay there for another moment thinking about it. Then I got up and went to help with the coffee. Those 7 days were not dramatic. That is the thing I want to say clearly, because the dramatic parts of a story have a way of crowding out the parts that matter more. Nothing large happened in those 7 days. No crises, no confrontations, no moments that a person watching from outside would have pointed to and said, "There, that is where things changed." What happened was smaller than that and more durable. The second morning I showed her the woodworking tools. My father's chisels, the small draw knife, the carving gouges that I kept wrapped in an oiled cloth because rust was the enemy of fine edges, and my father had been particular about his tools. She picked up the smallest chisel and held it the way you hold something that is not made for your hand, carefully aware of the mismatch. Her fingers were long, and her grip was strong, and the narrow handle sat in her palm like a pencil in the hand of a child. I showed her how to hold it lower where the balance was better. Had to stand close to do it close enough to guide her hand. She paid attention the way she paid attention to everything completely, without the distracted quality of someone who is thinking about something else. By the end of the hour she had made a clean cut along a piece of scrap pine that was straighter than my first attempts had been, and she looked at it with the focused satisfaction of someone who has learned a true thing. "Again," she said. The 4th day she began teaching me to read horses. Not to ride, I could ride adequately in the way of a man who uses horses for work rather than sport. But reading them was different. The position of the ears, the set of the neck, the particular tension in the hindquarters that preceded a kick, these were a language she had grown up speaking, and I had never formally learned. We stood at the paddock fence, and she talked and I listened. She pointed to things I had looked at 100 times without seeing. The way Garnet, my older mare, held her left ear slightly back when she was uncertain. The way the young gelding I called Pepper dropped his head before he decided something was acceptable. Small things, real things. I was a slow student. She was a patient teacher, patient without being indulgent, which is the harder kind. "Watch his eye," she said for the 3rd time of Pepper. "Not his feet. His feet tell you what he's already decided. His eye tells you what he's deciding." I watched the eye, began slowly to understand what I was looking at. The 5th morning I came out to find the gate to the south pasture repaired a hinge that had been binding for 2 months that I had been meaning to fix since March and had not gotten to. She had done it before dawn, before I was up, and said nothing about it when I came out. I looked at the hinge, looked at her. She was already headed to the barn. I did not say anything either. That evening I took out the carving tools and made a small wooden peg to replace a missing one in her trunk's iron clasp, which I had noticed was loose when we carried it in, left it on the trunk lid without comment. The following morning I found the peg installed. Neither of us mentioned any of this. It was not a competition, and it was not a performance. It was simply 2 people in proximity to each other's problems, fixing what they could fix. The 7th day she found the sketchbook. I know the exact moment because I had come back from the creek to get a tool I had forgotten, and I passed the window of the small room, and I saw her standing at the shelf with the sketchbook open in her hands. My sketchbook, where I had drawn the ring draft after draft of it, each one with something wrong, each one crossed out with a single line when I understood what the wrongness was. She did not know I had seen her. She stood with the book open, turning pages slowly, and her face had an expression that I had not yet seen there, not the careful neutrality she carried in public, not the focused attention of someone learning a new thing. Something quieter than both of those. Something that did not have a name I could put to it quickly. She put the book back exactly where it had been. That evening at supper she looked at me differently. Not dramatically differently, just differently. The way a room looks different when one piece of furniture has been moved, even if you cannot immediately say which piece. I thought about the sketchbook and the crossed-out drafts and wondered what she had read in them. I did not ask. It was not yet the moment for that conversation. But I began to understand that the moment was coming. On the 8th morning, Samuel Morrison came back. Not with his sons this time. Alone. I was in the barn when I heard him ride in, recognized the sound of his gray horse. A sound I had learned to recognize over 2 years of these conversations. I came out to find him dismounting at the fence, and we stood for a moment in the morning light with the pleasantries that men who do not entirely trust each other exchange when they find themselves in the same place. He had brought, he said, a concern. A neighborly concern, he was careful to say, which was the way Morrison prefaced things that were not entirely neighborly. Wanted to have a word, he said, man to man. I waited. He looked at the barn, at the pasture, at the repaired fence line. His eyes moved over all of it with the practiced assessment of a man who had been valuing land for 30 years. Good repairs on the north section, he said. Thank you. She do most of it. I looked at him steadily. We did it together. He nodded as though this confirmed something, took off his hat and turned it in his hands, a gesture I recognized as the one he used when he was working toward something he had decided to say obliquely. Your father, he said, was a man I respected. You've said so. I mean it. Thomas Sloane was a man who understood land, understood what it asked of you. He paused. Not every man has that. Takes a certain kind of steadiness. I said nothing. I had learned over 2 years of these conversations that the space where I did not respond was where Morrison's real meaning eventually appeared. He turned his hat once more. There's a matter, he said carefully, that I have been aware of for some time, that pertains to this property. I have debated whether to raise it. Something shifted in the morning air. Not the wind had not changed. Something else. Then raise it, I said. He looked at me directly for the first time since arriving. There is a filing, from your father's time, a promissory arrangement with the county land office, a matter of some paperwork that was left incomplete when he died. I became aware of it because I was involved at the periphery in the original arrangement. I kept my face still. Involved how? I said. As a guarantor. A formality at the time. Your father needed a second signature on a supply arrangement, early days, you understand, before the ranch was established. I signed as a guarantor on the understanding that the arrangement would be formalized within the year. He stopped, turned the hat again. It was not formalized, he said. Your father became ill. The paperwork was never completed. The obligation, a small one by today's standards, but an obligation nonetheless, remains technically open on the county register. The morning felt different now. Still bright, still clear, but different in the way that a room feels different when you understand that one of the walls is not as solid as you thought. How long have you known this? I said. Morrison had the grace not to answer immediately. Some years, he said finally. How many years? He put his hat back on. Since shortly after your father died. I stood with that for a moment. 2 years. He had known for 2 years, and he had come to me 3 times in those 2 years, asking about the land, and he had not mentioned it once. What is the obligation? I said. He named a figure. It was not large, he was right about that. By the standards of what the land was worth, by the standards of what I had built here in 6 years, it was not large. But an open obligation on the county register was not simply a matter of money. In the territory in that time, with the land title arrangements that governed property rights, an unresolved filing was a door that the right person could push open. Morrison was the right person. I am not raising this as a threat, he said. His voice was careful and his face was carefully open. I am raising it as a neighborly concern, because I would prefer to see it resolved without difficulty. And how do you propose it be resolved? I said. He looked out at the north pasture, at the land that my father and I had broken together, that I had kept alone for 2 years, that I had woken up every morning of the last 6 years, and walked out onto and understood as mine in the way that you understand a thing that you have worked for. There is a parcel on the north edge, he said, 30 acres. It's marginal land for your purposes, too rocky for most crops, and you're running fewer cattle than it would support. For my operation with the water rights it carries it would be useful. He said it the way a man says a thing he has rehearsed into something that sounds reasonable. You want 30 acres, I said, in exchange for the filing. In exchange for my assistance in resolving the filing through appropriate channels, which as the guarantor of record I am positioned to provide. I looked at him, looked at the hat on his head, and the gray horse at the fence, and the face of a man who had been patient for 2 years and had now decided the moment had arrived. I'll need time to consider it, I said. Of course, he said, no urgency. He said it in the way that made clear there was urgency. He rode out. I stood in the yard until the sound of his horse had faded. Then I went back into the barn and sat down on a hay bale and put my face in my hands and stayed there for a while. I did not tell Willa. Not that morning, and not at dinner, and not in the evening when we sat on the porch, and the valley went through its colors the way it did every evening reliably, regardless of what was happening at ground level. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. That was partly true. The fuller truth was that telling her required admitting that my land, the land I had promised my father I would keep, the land I had built this possibility on, the land I had placed that advertisement about, was standing on ground that was less solid than I had represented. To her, to myself, to anyone. The fuller truth was that I did not know how to say the thing I offered you may not be entirely mine to offer. So I carried it. Through the evening and through the night, lying awake listening to the wind, while Willa's footsteps moved quietly in the next room settling in. What I did not know, what I would not know until later, was that Fletcher Knox had not been entirely as discreet as I had assumed. Knox ran a circuit. That was his work and his life, the long loop between settlements carrying mail and goods, and the occasional passenger sleeping in the wagon when he could not make a town by nightfall. He knew the roads and the people on them, the way a man knows his own property, intuitively, thoroughly, including the parts that were not in good repair. He had known about the land filing before he brought Willa south from the stage junction. Had known because Morrison had let it slip intentionally or otherwise during a conversation the previous autumn about the Sloan property, one of several such conversations Knox had gathered that Morrison had been having with various people for some time. Knox had not told me. He told himself this was not his business, that it was a matter between landowners and the county register and the people involved, and that a man who drove a wagon for a living did not insert himself into such things. He told himself this in the way that people tell themselves things that they know underneath the telling are not entirely true. What brought him to Willa 3 days after Morrison's visit to my yard was not courage exactly. It was more like the accumulated weight of not saying something becoming heavier than the discomfort of saying it. I was out on the south pasture with Pepper when it happened, working with the gelding on the things Willa had been teaching me, practicing reading his eye rather than his feet, getting it wrong, and then less wrong, and then occasionally right. I did not see Knox's wagon come up the road. I did not see him pull up at the cabin, or go to the door, or speak to Willa on the porch in a low and serious voice for the better part of 20 minutes. I came back in at midday to find Willa at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface, and an expression that I had not seen before, not the careful neutrality, not the focused attention. This was the expression of someone who has received information and is in the process of deciding what to do with it. She looked up when I came in. "Knox was here," she said. I set down the fence tool I was carrying. "He told me about the filing," she said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something in the old oak, and the sound of it came through the window like a small, ordinary thing from a different world. I sat down at the table across from her. "I was going to tell you," I said. "I know," she said. "When? I don't know exactly. I was trying to figure out what to do about it first." She was quiet for a moment, looked at her hands on the table. "Morrison came here," she said, "to tell you." "Yes." "And offered to help resolve it in exchange for the north parcel." "Yes." She nodded slowly. Not with anger. I had prepared myself for anger because anger would have been reasonable, but with something more considered than that. The same expression she had used on Dakota, actually. The look of someone assessing what they were actually dealing with as opposed to what it appeared to be on the surface. "How long has he known?" she said. "Since shortly after my father died. 2 years. She was quiet with that for a long moment. Then, he waited. "Yes. Until you had something to lose." The words were plain and accurate, and I had not arranged them in exactly that order in my own thinking, but hearing them I understood immediately that they were correct. He had waited until there was more at stake, until I had placed an advertisement and written letters and built towards something that could be endangered as well as the land itself. "He waited until you had something to lose," she said again, not as repetition, but as confirmation, making sure she understood it fully. "And then he came." "Yes," I said. She stood up from the table, went to the window and looked out at the valley with her hands at her sides. I waited. There was something happening in the quality of her silence. Not anger, not quite, but the compression of anger into something more useful. "I need to go into town," she said. "What for?" "There is a man who comes through on the last Thursday of each month. A lawyer from the county seat. He makes a circuit of the outlying settlements. Eleanor Hayes told me about him." I looked at her. "When did you speak to Eleanor Hayes?" "The day I went to the general store for thread. She was in the shop." A small pause. "She told me quite a lot, actually. About the town. About various people in it." I thought about what Eleanor Hayes might have said. Eleanor had been in Harlan's Creek longer than almost anyone had come with her husband 30 years ago, had outlasted him by 12, had spent those 12 years watching the town from the particular vantage of a woman who was no longer required to be careful about what she noticed. "The lawyer," I said. "What are you thinking?" Willa turned from the window. "That a promissory arrangement with an incomplete filing is a legal matter, and that legal matters have legal remedies, and that before we give Morrison 30 acres of land or anything else, I want to know exactly what the filing says and what our options are." I looked at her. "This is your land," I said, because I felt I needed to say it clearly. "I'm not asking you to." "I know it's your land," she said. "That's why." She said it simply, without emphasis, and picked up her coat from the hook by the door. I sat at the kitchen table for a moment after she left, looking at the place where her hands had been flat on the surface. She was gone most of the afternoon. I worked. It is what I do when I cannot think my way through something. I find the physical work, and I do it because physical work at least produces a result you can see. I repaired a section of the calf pen, replaced a rotted board on the barn's south face, cleaned and oiled the harness that had been needing attention for a month. I thought about my father. He had told me to keep the land and not let it end quiet, and I had believed in the simple way you believe things your father says on his deathbed, that keeping it meant holding it, maintaining the fence line, not selling to Morrison when Morrison came asking. I had not understood that land can be taken sideways through paperwork and patience by a man willing to wait until the right moment. I thought about Morrison's face on the morning after Dakota and the garden, that uncharacteristic uncertainty, the something behind his usual expression that I had noticed and not been able to name. I understood it better now. He had been watching Willa in the way that a man recalculates when a situation changes. The arrival of someone who complicated his picture of the Sloan property, not simply a woman Emmett Sloan had brought in, but someone capable and directed who might understand things that Emmett Sloan alone had not understood. He had moved quickly. 3 days after the garden incident, he had come to me. The timing was not accidental. Willa came back at the edge of the afternoon when the light was starting to go long and gold. She came in through the front door and sat down at the kitchen table without taking off her coat, which told me the sitting down was not for rest, but for talking. I put down what I was doing and sat across from her. She had found the lawyer. His name was Beaumont, a circuit man who had been doing this route for 11 years and knew the county records the way he knew the roads by feel as much as by map. Eleanor Hayes had introduced them in the small room behind the post office where Beaumont conducted his consultations on circuit days. He looked at the filing details, Willa said. She was calm in the way that people are calm when they have been moving through difficulty and have come out the other side into something more manageable. The obligation is real. It was a supply arrangement like Morrison said. Your father needed a guarantor to secure equipment credit in the early years, and Morrison signed. The paperwork was never completed because your father got sick before the annual registration period. So Morrison can act on it, I said. He can make a claim based on it, she said. But Beaumont says the claim is not as strong as Morrison implied, because the arrangement was a guarantee, not a lien. Morrison guaranteed the debt, but the debt was to the supply company, not to Morrison. The supply company has been dissolved for 4 years, which means the obligation exists, but the party owed is complicated. I looked at her. Complicated, I said. Beaumont's word. What it means practically is that Morrison cannot simply foreclose on the filing. He can make it difficult, contest the title, file a claim that ties up the register, but he cannot take the land outright. And Beaumont says that for a man of Morrison's standing in the county, the public difficulty of making such a claim against a neighbor might outweigh the benefit of 30 acres of rocky north pasture. I sat with this. He'd have to make it public, file through the county office. Formally and on the record, Willa said, where it could be challenged, and where everyone would know he'd been sitting on a 2-year-old filing against his dead neighbor's son. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the valley was going toward evening in its colors. You did this today, I said, while I was here. You were worried about it, she said, and I knew someone who might know what to do. I was going to, I know, she said, but I was already in town. She said it without victory and without apology, which was somehow more than either would have been. I looked at my hands on the table, my father's hands, the patient kind. He's going to know, I said, that we consulted someone, that we know what he has and what he doesn't have. Yes, she said. And then? And then he'll have to decide whether the north pasture is worth the public record of how he tried to get it. She paused. Beaumont thinks he'll let it go. Men like Morrison, the reputation matters as much as the land, sometimes more. I thought about Morrison on his horse this morning, riding out with his careful face and his patient certainty, about the 2 years of waiting, about the 3 requests for the land, and the 3 answers, and the 4th approach that had been different from all the others. You might be right, I said. Beaumont might be right, she said. I just asked the right question. Outside, the evening was settling. The bird in the oak tree had stopped. The wind had come up slightly, the small evening wind off the ridge that was one of the reliable things about this place, one of the things I had come to count on without noticing. I thought about what she had done, not loudly, not with any announcement, simply gone into town and found the right person, and asked the right question, and come back with information that changed the shape of a problem I had been carrying for a day without being able to see around it. I thought about what it meant that she had done it. Not because she had been asked, not because it was her problem to solve, because she was here and she had seen a problem and she had the means to do something about it, and she had done it without requiring anything from me in exchange. That was what it meant. And sitting at that kitchen table in the going-down light, I understood something that I had been circling for a week without landing on. The thing I had written in my 3rd letter about 2 people making each other stronger, I had written it because it seemed true and important, but I had not known what it looked like until this moment. I had not known it looked like this, a woman at a kitchen table in her coat telling me calmly what she had found out, and the shape of things being different because she was in them. There's one more thing, she said. I looked up. Knox, she said. He knew about the filing before he brought me here. He told me so today. The room went still. He knew, I said. He said Morrison let it slip last autumn, during a conversation about this property. She paused. He said he told himself it wasn't his place to interfere. But he told you. Eventually. Her voice was even. He said carrying it had gotten heavier than saying it. I thought about Knox. about his particular loquacity on the subject of road conditions on the morning of Willa's arrival, his careful business with the horses and the luggage, the way he had cleared his throat in the yard when things were awkward. He had known what he was bringing into, or known a version of it. "What did you say to him?" I asked. "I thanked him," she said. "He could have kept quiet. He didn't in the end." I thought about that, about the difference between people who never say the difficult thing and people who say it late, which is its own kind of courage, the harder kind, because it comes with the knowledge of having waited. "What do we do about Morrison?" I said. "Directly. Tomorrow or the next day when he comes back for an answer." Willa was quiet for a moment. "You tell him you've looked into the matter," she said. "That you've spoken with a lawyer about the nature of the filing and your options, that you intend to address it through appropriate channels, and that the North Pasture is not available." Just like that. Just like that. I looked at her. "He won't like it." "No," she said, "he won't. And if he moves forward anyway, contests the title, then Beaumont will represent you and the matter will go on the county record, and everyone in Harlan's Creek will know what Samuel Morrison did with information about a dead man's incomplete paperwork." She met my eyes. "He knows that. That's why he came to you privately first." I sat with it all, the filing, the 2 years of waiting, the carefully worded approach in my yard that was designed to look like a favor. The patience of a man who had decided the land would eventually come to him and had been methodical about arranging the circumstances. I thought about my father's name in the bark of the oak tree growing deeper every year. "I'll talk to him," I said. "We'll talk to him," she said. She said it quietly, without making anything of it. Just the plain statement of what was true. Outside, the evening was fully down now. The stars were beginning in the east, the early ones, the ones that arrive before the sky has finished deciding it is night. I looked at Willa across the kitchen table, at her steady hands and her steady face, and the coat she had not yet taken off, and I thought about 9 drafts of a letter, and a ring made of oak, and all the things a person cannot know when they sit down to write the truest version of themselves they can manage. I thought about how none of it had been enough to prepare me for this, and how it had been exactly enough. Morrison came on a Thursday. I had expected him sooner. 2 days had passed since Willa's visit to Beaumont, 2 days in which I had woken each morning half listening for the sound of his gray horse on the road, and he had not come. The waiting had its own quality, not dread exactly, but the attention of a man who knows something is approaching and cannot yet see it on the horizon. On the 3rd morning, I stopped waiting for him and went back to work. That is when he came. I was at the woodworking bench in the barn, the same bench where my father had kept his tools, where I had started the ring the previous winter, where I spent the quiet hours of the afternoon when the light came through the south window at the angle that made fine work possible. I was making a peg joint for a section of the calf pen gate, fitting the tenon to the mortise, with the patience the work required, when I heard his horse in the yard. I set down the chisel, wiped my hands on the cloth I kept on the bench corner, stood for a moment in the barn's interior in the smell of hay and horse and old wood, and thought about my father. Not his words this time, just his hands. The way they had moved over a piece of wood, certain and unhurried, finding the grain and following it rather than forcing against it. The way he had taught me that the material had something to say about what it wanted to become, and that the work went better when you listened. I went out to meet Morrison. He had brought James this time. The eldest son sat his horse at the gate while Morrison dismounted in the yard, and I read the presence of the boy as what it was, not a threat, not quite, but a witness, a piece of staging. Morrison was a man who understood the weight of being observed. I let him come to me rather than going to him, stood at the barn door with my hands at my sides, and let him cross the yard. "Sloan," he said. "Morrison." He looked at the barn, at the pasture beyond. The same survey he always made the habit of a man who sees land first and the people on it second. "I expect you've had time to think over our conversation," he said. "I have," I said. "I've also had time to look into the matter. With a lawyer." Something moved across Morrison's face, too quick to name there and gone. He had not expected that, or had not expected it so quickly. "Beaumont," I said. "He comes through on Thursdays." Eleanor Hayes was kind enough to make an introduction. Morrison was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. "Beaumont's a capable man," he said carefully. "He is." He looked into the filing, the obligation, the nature of it, who holds the claim. I paused. He was thorough. And what was his assessment? "That the matter is resolvable," I said, "through appropriate channels, without the transfer of any land." The yard was very quiet. Behind me I was aware of the barn with my father's bench in it. Ahead of me Morrison in his hat with his son at the gate behind him, and the whole apparatus of his patience and his certainty and his 2 years of waiting arranged around him like a coat he had worn so long he no longer felt its weight. He was quiet for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face, the same movement I had seen on the morning of the garden, that brief uncertainty in a man who was not accustomed to uncertainty, and he looked past my left shoulder. The same shift I had seen on the morning of the garden, that unfamiliar uncertainty. I turned. Willa was standing at the corner of the barn. She had come from the direction of the pasture, had been working with the horses. I realized which was where she spent most mornings now, and had come around the corner at some point during the conversation. She was not doing anything, just standing, her hands at her sides, her posture straight, watching with the same focused stillness she had used on Dakota. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Morrison took in the whole of it. Willa at the barn corner, the fence line we had repaired together, the garden coming back from what Dakota had done to it, the north pasture with its water rights he had wanted. His gaze moved the way it always moved, barn to pasture to fence line, but this time when it came back to me, it landed differently. The arithmetic was changing. Not the arithmetic of the filing and the north parcel, that calculation was already done. The larger one. The one that involved what he was actually standing in front of. He was doing the arithmetic. I could see it happening. Not the arithmetic of the filing and the north parcel, that calculation was already changing, already coming up different than he had planned. The larger arithmetic, the one that involved what he was actually looking at, which was not an uncertain young man alone on land he was not sure he could keep, which was something else. "Beaumont's a reasonable man," Morrison said again. His voice was still careful, but the certainty had gone out of the underside of it. That layer of settled patience was not there the way it had been. "If he thinks the matter can be resolved through the county office, I would not stand in the way of that." I looked at him. "The north parcel," I said, "is not available." "No," he said after a moment. "I don't suppose it is." We stood in the yard. The morning was clear, one of those late spring mornings that seem to have more light in them than the season warrants, everything sharp and clean after a night of wind. A hawk was working the updraft above the south ridge, turning slow circles. Morrison put his hat back on. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before, not the careful neutrality, not the assessing patience that had been there every time he had looked at the Sloan land for 2 years. Something had shifted underneath, the way a river shifts when the bed changes, not visible on the surface until the current shows it. "Your father," he said, and stopped. I waited. "Thomas was a better man than I gave him room to be," he said. He was quiet for another moment. Then, as though deciding something, he said, "My niece, Clara. She asked about you 3 years back when you were still new to the land." I looked at him. "I told her the Sloan place wasn't a sound proposition," he said. "That was the word I used. Proposition." He turned his hat once in his hands. "She took my advice. Married the Garfield boy instead." I understood then why he had known for 2 years about the filing, and said nothing. It was not only about the land. It was about a man who had decided early what the Sloan place was worth, and had been watching quietly to see if he was right. "She's content," Morrison said. "Clara, I want you to know I believe that." "I'm sure she is," I said. He nodded, put his hat back on. The words came out like something that had been pressed flat and was slowly returning to its shape. "Early days, when we were both getting started, I had ideas about how things worked, who could make it and who couldn't. Your father didn't fit my ideas, and I gave him less than he was owed." The yard held very still. "He never said anything about it," I said. "No," said Morrison. "He wouldn't have. That was Thomas." He looked at the barn again, at the name I had carved in the oak tree by the creek, though he could not see it from where we stood, at something in the middle distance that may have been 25 years ago. "I'll contact the county office," he said. "Have my name removed from the guarantee record. I should have done it years ago." He said it flatly, without ceremony, the way a man says a thing he has decided to say and does not want to make more of than it is. I nodded. He turned and walked back to his horse. Swung up. J. James at the gate looked between his father and me and said nothing. He was 19 and he had heard everything, and he did not yet have the years to know what to do with it. Morrison gathered his reins. He looked at me one more time from horseback, looked at me in the way that people look when they are adjusting an old picture to a new frame. "Good land," he said. "Your father chose well." Then he turned the gray horse and rode out through the gate and down the road toward his own property, and I stood in the yard and watched him go, and the hawk above the south ridge turned one more slow circle and then moved on. Willa came to stand beside me. We watched the dust settle from Morrison's horse until there was no more dust to watch. The morning continued its business around us, the horses in the paddock, the creek talking to itself beyond the oak tree, the ordinary sounds of a working ranch on a clear spring morning. "He'll do it," she said. "What he said." "I think so," I said, "because it costs him less than the alternative." "Partly," I said, "and partly because he's been carrying it a long time." She considered that. "The thing about your father?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "That was real," she said. "Not a question." "It was real," I said. We stood in the yard a while longer, not moving anywhere in particular. The morning had opened up around the conversation with Morrison the way mornings open up after weather has moved through the same light as before, but more room in it somehow. "Thank you," I said, "for Beaumont, for going." She looked sideways at me. "You were going to figure it out?" "Eventually. I was already in town." I almost smiled. "You keep saying that." "It keeps being true." I looked at the land. North pasture with its rocky soil and its water rights that Morrison had wanted. South pasture where Pepper was making his considered way along the fence line. The barn with my father's tools. The garden that was coming back from what Dakota had done to it. The roses replanted from cuttings Eleanor Hayes had brought over without being asked, wrapped in damp cloth the way her own mother had wrapped them crossing half a continent. I put my hand against my vest pocket. "I have something I've been meaning to do," I said. I went inside and got the ring. Not from my vest pocket, I had moved it that morning, finally out of the pocket where it had lived for weeks. Like a question, I kept checking to see if I was ready to answer yet. I had put it in the small wooden box on the shelf above the wash basin, the box where I kept the things that mattered, the tin button that had been my father's, the folded letter from my mother that I had read so many times, the folds had gone soft. I took the ring out of the box and stood in the kitchen for a moment. It was small. I had made it small because I had imagined small hands, and the hands I had imagined did not belong to the woman outside. I knew this. I had known it since the afternoon of the first day when I had looked at Willa's hands and understood immediately that 3 months of careful work had been done in the service of a fiction. I also knew what Willa had seen when she looked at the sketchbook, the crossed-out drafts, the evidence of trying. She had not said anything about it, but I had seen her face change in a way that told me something had shifted, and I understood now what that shift was. She had not seen a ring that was too small. She had seen the work. I went back outside. Willa was at the fence of the paddock, her arms folded along the top rail, watching Pepper work out his feelings about the morning. She did not turn when she heard me come up beside her, just moved slightly to make room. We stood at the fence for a moment watching the horse. In my third letter, I said, I wrote something about partnership. "I remember," she said. "When I wrote it, I meant it. But I thought I understood what it looked like. I had a picture of it." She was still watching Pepper. What did it look like? Smaller, I said. Quieter, easier to see. She said nothing. This past week, I said. Watching you with the horses, working the fence, going into town without being asked, standing at the barn corner this morning without saying a word, and doing whatever it is you did that made the whole thing different. I stopped. That's what it looks like. What I meant when I wrote that letter, I just didn't know it yet. The horse moved along the fence line. A cloud passed over the sun and the light changed briefly and then returned. I made something for you, I said. Back in the winter when your letters were the best part of the long days. I took the ring out of my pocket, held it out to her on my palm. The oak wood was smooth and pale in the morning light, the grain of it visible the hours of work that had gone into the surface. She looked at it. Then she picked it up carefully between two fingers and held it up and turned it, examining the grain the way she had examined the woodworking tools on the second morning, with the attention of someone who understands the work that went into a thing and is looking for it. You made this before you met me, she said. Yes. You didn't know anything about my hands. No, I said. I imagined them wrong. She turned the ring once more, looked at it for a long moment. Then she did something I had not expected. She put it on her finger. It stopped at the second knuckle as I had known it would, the wood too narrow by a full size for her hand. She held it there anyway, perched at the knuckle, the small circle of oak against the weathered capability of her hand. 3 months, she said. You spent 3 months making this for a woman you'd never met. Yes. Based on letters. Yes. She lowered her hand and looked at the ring where it sat too small on her finger. Do you know what that tells me? I shook my head. It tells me you take things seriously when they matter to you. She paused. Not carefully. Seriously. There's a difference. Careful is about protecting yourself. Serious is about the thing itself. She slipped the ring off her finger, held it in her palm the way I had held it out to her. Looked at it. It can be resized, she said. It can. You'd have to split it and add a piece. The grain would show the join. Yes, I said. It would. She closed her hand around it for a moment. Then she opened her hand and placed it back in mine and closed my fingers around it. Ask me, she said. Not because of the arrangement, not because of the letters. Ask me because you want to. I looked at her. At the gray eyes that were clearer in morning light than any other time, at the hands that had fixed my gate and set my fence posts and walked up to my bull and placed themselves flat on my kitchen table and done quietly the work that needed doing. Willa Blaine, I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. Will you marry me? Not because we planned it and not because it's the sensible conclusion to what we've been doing this past week. Because I think we're building something here that neither of us could build by ourselves. And because the past 7 days have been the least lonely days I've had in 3 years. And because you found the right question to ask, and I want to be around for the rest of them. She was quiet for a long moment. Yes, she said. Then, but I have conditions. I waited. We resized the ring together. You show me how I want to understand the work, not just wear the result. All right. And I'm going to make one for you. You'll have to teach me what I need to know because mine won't be as fine as this one, but I want to make it. Something moved in my chest that took me a moment to identify because it was not a feeling I had much experience with. It was, I thought, the specific relief of a hope being answered that you had been afraid to hold too directly. All right, I said again. And one more thing. She looked at me with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. You have to let me teach you to read horses properly, not just the basics, all of it. You're still watching the feet too much. I know, I said. You're getting better. You're a good teacher. You're a slow student. Yes, I said. But I'm thorough. She looked at me for a moment. Then the expression that had been in the neighborhood of a smile arrived at its destination, and it changed her face the way weather changes a landscape completely and for the better. It was the first time I had seen her smile like that, without reservation, without the careful management of what she allowed to show. I kept it, the image of it, stored it the way I had stored my father's words, not consciously, not as a decision, but in the place where the things that matter to you end up living without asking permission. We were married in October. The valley was at its best by then. The cottonwoods along the creek gone gold, the scrub oak on the ridge in its deep red, the sky, the hard, clean blue of autumn. In this country, the kind of blue that looks like something has been removed from the air to allow it. The church in Harlan's Creek was small, as churches in those towns were small, whitewashed plain, a wood stove at the back that someone always lit too late, so the first half of any service was cold, and the second half was almost warm. The pews were full. I had not expected the pews to be full, and then I had looked at the town with clearer eyes and understood that they would be, because this was the kind of place where people came to see what had happened, and something had happened in Harlan's Creek that summer, something that did not have a clean name, something about what a man was and what a woman was and what strength looked like and who got to decide. People came to see how it had turned out. Morrison was there. He sat in the third pew on the right side alone without his sons. I noticed him when I came in, and we looked at each other across the room with the look of men who have finished one version of a thing and are beginning another version that neither has a complete picture of yet. He had been as good as his word about the county office. The filing had been resolved 6 weeks after our conversation in the yard, quietly and without drama, Beaumont handling the paperwork and Morrison signing what needed to be signed. He had not come back to the ranch since the morning of the hawk and the settling dust. I had not expected him to, but he was in the church and he had come alone, and I thought I understood something about what that meant. Mrs. Henderson was there in the fourth pew left side with the posture of a woman who has revised her opinion but is not prepared to announce it publicly. She had brought food, a covered dish that she left on the table outside the church door with no note attached. The food was good. I knew whose it was. We both knew whose it was. Nothing was required to be said. Eleanor Hayes stood at the back near the door, which was where she usually placed herself at community gatherings, close enough to see everything, far enough to leave quickly if she chose. She wore a dark dress and her good hat, and an expression of someone watching a thing come out right that they had hoped would come out right, but had not allowed themselves to expect. When Willa came in, Eleanor nodded once. Willa saw it. Something passed between them, the quick private communication of women who have understood each other without requiring the full apparatus of explanation. The rings were oak, both of them made from the same branch, the one that had come down in the winter storms of 1886 and that I had carried in from the snow without knowing why. There had been enough of it for two, it turned out. Willa had made hers for me over the weeks of October. She had not been wrong that hers would not be as fine as the one I had made for her. The surface was not as smooth and the proportions were not as even, and in one section you could see where she had not yet mastered the draw knife and had taken more than she intended. She had been matter-of-fact about these imperfections. I had been careful not to make too much of them in her presence, but when she was out of the barn, I had sometimes picked it up and looked at it with an attention that was not critical. The join in hers where we had split and resized the wood to fit her hand was visible, a clean seam running along the top of the ring where the new piece had been fitted in. She had finished the surface carefully on both sides of the seam, matching the grain as closely as the material allowed, but you could see it. You knew it had been added. I thought this made it more accurate, not less. We stood at the front of the church and exchanged the rings and said the words, and the wood stove at the back was doing its usual late work on the temperature. When I put the ring on her finger, fit now properly sized, the oak smooth against her skin, I felt the weight of the object as though for the first time. 3 months of making, and 3 more months of waiting, and 6 months of everything that had happened between her stepping off Knox's wagon and this moment. She put hers on my finger. Her hands were steady as they always were. "Well," said the preacher, who was a practical man, "that's done then." There was laughter, the warm, relieved kind that comes when something difficult has been navigated to a good landing. 6 months after that, the first harvest came in. Better than any year since my father had worked the land. The garden had recovered fully from Dakota. Some of the roses Mrs. Henderson had helped replant were already establishing themselves along the south fence, though they would not bloom until spring. The cattle herd was the best it had ever been. Willa had an eye for animal health that was different from anything I had seen. She could look at a calf and tell you, before any sign was visible, that something was going to need attention, and she was right often enough that I had stopped questioning it and started paying attention to what she was looking at. We had begun to be known in the valley as a certain kind of operation, not the largest, not the most established, but the one where things were done with a particular steadiness, where problems got addressed before they became crises, where if you asked a question you got a straight answer. Dakota, in his repaired pen with its reinforced posts and its proper latching, had settled into what I could only describe as a philosophical old age. He produced calves that were the best in the region. He no longer charged anyone who approached correctly. Willa had been working with him through the summer in the way she worked with all the animals consistently, without drama, establishing terms that both parties could live with. He still did not like me particularly. "He respects you," Willa said when I mentioned this. "There's a difference," I said. "Yes," she said, "but it's a more durable one." One evening in November, the 2nd November, we sat on the porch after supper and watched the darkness come down from the ridge in its stages. The first winter was behind us. The kind of winter that tests things, the cold coming early a week in January, when the temperature dropped so far that we had to bring 2 of the younger calves into the barn, a stretch of storm that kept us mostly inside for 4 days, and which I had been quietly concerned about beforehand, turned out to be easier than I expected. Not because it was not hard, because we had by then developed the competence of 2 people who know how to be in close quarters with each other, who know when to talk and when not to, who have learned each other's rhythms well enough that the small irritations of confinement do not accumulate into larger ones. It takes time to learn those things. It takes doing the ordinary work of days together, the meals and the chores and the evenings, without any guarantee of how it will go. Willa had her boots up on the porch rail and a cup of coffee in her hands and was looking at the ridge where the last of the light was leaving. I had the wooden box from the shelf in my lap, the one that held the things that mattered. I had taken it out not for any clear reason, just the way you sometimes take out a thing and hold it because it belongs in your hands. I took out the tin button that had been my father's, turned it in the lamplight. The letters stamped into it were worn to almost nothing, some regimental mark from before he came west, before I was born. "Tell me about him," Willa said. She was still looking at the ridge. She asked about my father sometimes in the evenings, not often, not with any pressure, just when the moment made room for it. I thought about where to start. "He was small," I said. "Smaller than me. He used to say it was a family tradition." I turned the button. "He didn't talk much, but when he said something it was worth listening to." "What did he say to you?" she asked. "At the end." I had told her pieces of this, not all of it. "He said to keep the land," I said. "Don't let it end quiet, that's what he said." She was quiet for a moment. "And has it—" I looked out at the valley in the dark at the fence line I could not see but knew was there at the creek I could hear at the oak tree, in whose bark my father's name was growing deeper each year. "No," I said, "it has not ended quiet." She turned from the ridge and looked at me. In the lamplight, her face was the face I had come to know over these months. The angles of it I had come to know, the gray eyes, the expression that was so often careful and so occasionally in moments like this one open. "Good," she said. I put the button back in the box, took out the ring, the original one, the too small one, which I had kept after the resizing, unable to dispose of it because it still seemed to contain something I was not ready to let go of. I held it in my palm. The wood was pale and smooth, small, made for a woman I had not known. Willa reached over and picked it up from my palm, held it up to look at it the way she had the first time in the morning light at the paddock fence. "You kept it," she said. "Yes. Why?" I thought about it. "Because it was made honestly," I said, "even though it was wrong. It was made out of the best picture I had at the time, and I don't know, throwing it away seemed like saying the picture was worthless. It wasn't worthless. It was just incomplete. She looked at the ring for a moment longer. Then she put it in my palm and closed my fingers around it. "Keep it," she said. "I intend to." She picked up her coffee, looked back at the ridge. The dark was fully down now, and the stars were coming in from the east, the early ones that my father used to name when I was a boy standing in a field in Missouri before any of this existed. "Emmett," she said. "Yes." "The east fence. That third post from the gate." I thought about it. "I noticed it this morning," I said. "I was going to get to it tomorrow." "All right," she said. We sat in the comfortable way that people sit when they have run out of things that need to be said and have not yet run out of each other's company. The creek kept talking. The stars continued their business. Somewhere in the north pasture, Dakota moved in his pen with the slow, heavy gravity of an animal that has decided finally that where he is where he intends to be. I am past 50 now, and I have told this story in different ways to different people, and each time I tell it, I notice something I did not notice before. The thing I notice most lately is how much of it happened quietly. The important parts. The parts that made the difference. Not the bull in the garden, though I have told that part more times than any other, and it never fails to get a reaction, and it is all true, every word of it. Not Morrison in the yard, and not the conversation in the church at Beaumont's consultation table, and not the morning I walked 3 miles in a storm and came back with my hands shaking from the cold. The important parts were the 7 days that nobody saw, the cough that Willa fixed without telling me, the sketchbook she put back without asking, the gate I fixed without asking, the way a person learns to move in a kitchen when there is another person in it, the long evenings of saying almost nothing and meaning everything by it. That is the thing about a life built with another person. The large moments are real, and they matter, and you carry them. But the structure is made of something smaller than that. It is made of the daily accumulation of small choices to show up, to pay attention, to do the thing that needs doing without waiting to be asked, to trust the other person's judgment in the moments when your own fails. To stay. I open the drawer sometimes. Take out the ring, the small one, the wrong one, the first one. Hold it for a moment. Willa is usually somewhere I can hear her. In the barn this time of year, or in the garden that came back from what Dakota did to it and is now larger and better than before, or at the kitchen table with the accounts that she has kept with a precision I have never matched. Sometimes I can hear her talking to the horses in that low, continuous way, the sound of water over stones. I hold the ring in my patient hands, my father's hands, and I think about the man who made it. He did not know what he was doing, that man. He sat in a kitchen in the middle of the night with 9 crumpled drafts around him and a piece of oak on the workbench and a loneliness that had gotten heavier than he could sleep off, and he made the best picture he could with what he had. He was wrong about almost everything. He got the important part right.